pinpointing the nature of teaching uh, as some kind of general answer is a very difficult affair. People can study teaching from the historical perspective, and they can start looking at how in the early societies teaching was done and how it is done today on various kinds of historical times in between. One can look at teaching from sociological perspective, how it influences people, what its impact are, whether they are thought through or whether they are unseen impact, etc. I do believe that all these perspectives are useful in understanding the complex picture of teaching. One of these perspectives, not the ultimate, not the final, nor any more informing or of greater importance than others, but one of the perspectives can also come from the philosophy of education. If we look from the philosophical angle on about the nature of teaching, we start thinking, then this is quite impossible without reference to two or three earlier questions. That is, aims of teaching is one very important, or aims of education is one very important kind of consideration. Then there are debates about education, whether there is a difference between training or general education. So one has to be clear in mind, nature of teaching in a training might be slightly different from nature of training in general education. Then there are issues on teaching, whether this is something which indoctrinates people or conditions people. So all these things one has to take into consideration. Now, with this background, whenever one describes the nature of teaching, there could be some portion which relates more to human nature and psychology of learning, and that might be common throughout these perspectives. And another aspect of teaching will very closely connect with the aims of education and the way one looks at education. I don't think I'm qualified about the psychological perspective and that part. Therefore, my limited area remains the philosophical consideration from the aims point of view. Supposing, now to understand teaching, supposing that one aim of education which is generally debated and with slight variations is accepted, is the capability of the learner to become independent in thought and action and contribute to the society. If I take that part of aims of education and then I start looking at what would be the necessary attributes of teaching which can help me progress in that direction, then a few things become very clear. One is that independence involves independence of thought, both in terms of knowledge and in terms of moral values, which means that I have to teach my students in such a manner that they can make their own informed decision regarding what to believe and what to do. Knowledge is associated with forming beliefs, and morality is associated with choosing action, what we want to do. This might have certain kinds of imperatives the way I progress in it. As a teacher, I am left with no choice but to help the student develop his or her own reason and rational perspective and make her own decisions. This immediately brings to me to the cognitive respect or rational respect of the student, which means that as a teacher, this often might be the case that I know more than the student, or at least I believe that I know more than the student. But at the same time, if my aims of education are as I have talked just now before, uh, then I cannot expect my student to take my statements or what I want to teach on face value. Now we can extend this definition or this requirement of teaching to the textbook and other sources of knowledge as well, which means that the student, a good teacher, doesn't try to make the student accept claims of knowledge based either on his own authority or the textbook's authority. So therefore the only alternative left to a good teacher in this sense is that student should be able to make his or her own judgment on that. That happens only when a teacher also gives reasons behind or justification for what she wants the student to believe. And teacher also considers the student a judge of deciding whether those justifications or whether the grounds for belief are adequate or not. So the first thing is cognitive respect. The second thing now is that teacher is advancing his or her grounds to a person who may not be at this moment capable of a thorough rational judgment on this, which means the teacher is vulnerable. His views might be rejected, not on very solid rational grounds, but because of various other kinds of things. And a teacher has to be humble enough to accept that. Now, this kind of humility and acceptance of this vulnerability requires a lot of courage. When you are talking to someone who is very discerning and can actually judge your claims and grounds on very sound, rational grounds, then you can actually debate that person at a different level. But when a student is doing that, and you see that there is no way of progressing any further, then you have to be humble as well as courageous, and you have to keep trying for the future. All I am saying in this is that one important aspect of teaching is if we have the aim I mentioned of education, then development of region, which requires the full respect for the cognitive and rational autonomy, and therefore teacher has to present things in a certain manner. To my mind, this is not the full story. Another part is most of the definitions of education have this condition that our method should be morally acceptable. Now, one dimension of morally acceptability of the pedagogy would be again respecting the choice and not coercing the student, which means that teaching would require negotiation. First I was talking about imparting or forming beliefs. Now I am talking even to start the pedagogy, even to start teaching, one might require motivational aspects which are non-coercive, which are non-cheating. So that is another aspect, moral aspect of teaching. It also seems to be very important to me, though that is included in the first one, that good teaching has all the time strived to avoid indoctrination. Because indoctrination is imparting beliefs in such a manner that they cannot be questioned. They block further learning and independence of thought. Therefore, that is another very important aspect of teaching. All this I am describing in very abstract terms from the philosophical perspective. This could be translated into the classroom, depending on the, or rather I should say how it will be translated into the classroom, into action, will depend on the understanding of the teacher, understanding of the student, and current level of learning of the student and the context, socio-cultural context. So therefore teaching is also from this perspective socio-culturally embedded. Now what purpose, part of your question was, what purpose this philosophical definition serves if teaching is determined by these socio-cultural, historical, economic reasons. Uh, it seems to me that all these perspectives can describe the current teaching as it is happening. Therefore, uh, they can answer the question, what is the case, how the teaching is done, how teaching is understood by teachers or students or parents or policy makers. They cannot critique that unless until they have a philosophical perspective, unless until they have some kind of half formulated or whatever kind of perspective on what teaching ought to be. What I am pointing out here is a general principle that when we critique something, then at the back of our mind, whether analyzed or not, whether articulated or not, there is a picture of what ought to be, and we critique in the light of that picture. So the philosophy helps us examine, form that picture on rational